Hey, so hopefully my eyes will be nicer to me this week. I am reading The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley, and this is Chapter 5, Lost Amid the Rocks. But although Miles Cabot was lost, he was free for the first time since his return to Poros. So, not disheartened, he arose and proceeded along the trail, looking for food and a place to spend the night, and presently came upon a green cow, as he was wont to call the aphids, which were kept both by Cupians and Formians for the honeydew which they produce. It made no objection to Cabot's approach, nor to his manipulating the two horns which projected from its back, with the result that the tired man was presently regaling himself with satisfying draughts of green milk from a leafy cup. The bush which furnished the leaf to fashion the cup closely resembled the tartan bushes of Cupia, whose heart-shaped leaves were put to so many uses in the country. Miles Cabot accordingly stripped off a considerable portion of the foliage and lay down in a bed of warm thick green for the night. The morning dawned silver bright. Miles drew another meal from the grazing aphid, and then presently presided on a rocky defile. He did not dare return for fear of meeting ant-men, and besides, now that a night's rest had some extent tempered his chagrin at not catching up to the particular ant-man whom he'd been pursuing, he could not be sure he'd taken the wrong road after all. So on he went, up the rocky path. Around noon, the path petered out at the top of an eminence, which gave Cabot an opportunity to survey the surrounding scenery. To the westward lay the city which he had fled. What had become, he wondered, of the supporters of his friend Doggo, and of Formus the ant-queen, whose cause he had espoused? According to Emu, Doggo and Formus were both dead, or Cabot would never have deserted them. Cabot turned his attention next to the northward. To his great joy, on the next peak to one where he sat, there stood two rough wooden towers, spanned by an aerial. He decided to cut across the country and attempt to approach the installation by stealth. So he started scrambling down into the intervening valley. Never before had the Earthman traveled through such difficult country. As soon as he had gone a short distance below the summit, he entered a continuous expanse of boulders ranging in size from a man's head to 20 feet or more in diameter, and piled aimlessly together. Lying crossways in every direction upon and between the rocks were the gaunt skeletons of fallen trees in all stages of decay. The sharp edges of the rocks cut and tore the bare feet of the Earthman, while the splinters of the fallen trees jabbed his body. Time and again he slipped and nearly fell into one of the chasms which yawned between the boulders, and on one of these occasions he must have inadvertently let go of the ant rifle which he had treasured so far so carefully, for presently he noticed that it was gone. But to all this there was one extenuating feature, although Miles did not realize it at the time, namely that his physical pain and need for constant vigilance on his part so occupied his mind as to spare him from the mental pain which had been his almost constant companion since returning to Poros. The attention necessary to avoid misjudging a jump, or slipping into a dark deep hole, or being impaled by a tree branch, crowded out of his mind even the great love and anxiety he had for Princess Lilla and baby Q. Through the maze of obstacles Cabot toiled all day long. Oh, to reach the radio station established by his enemy Yuri and get in touch with his own continent. Thus he could learn what was happening in Cupia and give word to his own safe arrival on the planet. Safe. He smiled grimly at the word. I must reach the station, he thought, and then, when I have talked with Cupia, I must secure a Formian plane by hook or crook, and brave the boiling seas. If the ants cross those seas safely, if Yuri has crossed them twice, then why can I not the Minorian? He communed thus with himself. A faint pink flush appeared in the sky. Slowly, painfully, he continued his way. Gradually, the pink light turned to crimson, and in the west, and then it darkened into the royal purple. Gradually the black night crept up out of the east, but so gradually the boulders became smaller and smaller as he clambered upward until, just as darkness finally enveloped the planet, the tired man gained the smooth rocks of the summit and lay down amid some leaves. He had nothing to eat or drink since the breakfast of green milk the morning. He had undergone an exhausting journey, His feet were bruised and cut, his body covered with innumerable scratches, and he was weary, thirsty, hungry. But he had almost reached the point which he had been seeking, and this thought comforted him as his eyes closed in a healthy and dreamless sleep. Next morning, early, he was up, rested and parched and ravenous. As the first faint pink tinged the eastern sky, Miles Cabot shook off the leaves and completed the ascent. It only required a few moments for him to reach the top, a narrow plateau about a mile in length, near the further end of which stood the small cabin with 2 towers and aerial. With a cry of joy, which he knew the earless Formians would never hear, he raced toward it. The huge chain and lock which secured its door on the outside indicated that it was unoccupied, and a glance through the narrow slit-like windows confirmed this. The glance through the window also revealed the presence of a complete radio, sending and receiving set of the same general hookup which he himself had adapted for the use of Cupians and Formians on the other continent. Imitation is the most insulting form of flattery, as Poblath, the Cupian philosopher, used to say. Yet Cabot was willing to brook the insult, until suddenly it dawned on him that the set had no earphones or a microphone. Of course not, since it was designed for use by creatures who possess neither ears nor vocal speech. Gone, then, was all hope of news from home, even if he could succeed in breaking in. At the most, he would merely be able, by interposing an interpreter in the primary or secondary of the aerial circuit, to send a dot dash message across the boiling seas. I use the term aerial circuit because antenna circuit would be ambiguous, as the latter term might have either its conventional Earth significance, or it might mean the circuit in which the Formian operator could place his living antenna in the sending and receiving. Well, even a chance to send to Cupia a message to the effect that he was free and safe by dot would be worth something. Miles tried the slit-like windows, and finding them too narrow, slid quickly down the nearby slope, soon to return laboriously with a 20-pound rock which he heaved against the door. Again and again he heaved the rock, until he had the satisfaction of seeing the door crack and then give. Finally, a large enough opening was effected to afford passage for a man, although not a Formian, and through this breach Miles Cabot squeezed into the station. A few minutes' scrutiny familiarized him with the details of the hookup, the generator set, the Trofil engine. Everything was in running order, and the fuel tank was full. So he fashioned a rude sending key, broke one of the circuits, and tied in the key. Then he warmed up and cranked the Trofil engine, clutched in the generator, threw the main switch, and sat down to flash across the seas the message which was to hold firm his partisans in Cupia until he could join them. But at that instant an arrow hummed through the hole in the door and struck quivering in the bench beside him. Cabot sprang to his feet, slid home the large beam which barred the door on the inside. This was a precaution which he had neglected to take before. Next he filled the hole in the door with some boards, hastily wrenched from the workbench. Then, picking up a Formian rifle and bandolier which hung on the wall, he made his way to the slit windows, and on the same side as the door peeped cautiously out. The result was immediate. An arrow sped through the window and passed just above his head. But even as he ducked instinctively, he saw a dark form moving behind a bush at some distance outside. So quickly rising again, he discharged the rifle square at the bush. There came a cry of pain, followed by silence, and there was no more feathered incursions. Not knowing whether his enemy had been disposed of, or whether the cessation of stream of arrows was merely a ruse to entice him from his shelter, Miles did not dare venture forth to investigate. From the first time the arrow had struck the workbench until the final squelching in the unknown enemy, Miles had been engrossed in action. Now came the reaction, as he realized how narrowly he had twice escaped death in the last few minutes. He shuddered at the thought, and turned pale, not, however, at the danger to himself, but rather at the danger to his loved ones in Cupia. He had to keep himself alive until he could reach and save them from whatever peril it was that caused Lilla to send an SOS, which had recalled him to Poros in the first place. But, being ever the inquisitive scientist, his attention was soon distracted by the arrow which stood sticking to the bench. Its shaft was of some hard and very springy wood, its tip was of chipped stone resembling flint, and bound to the shaft by vegetable fibers. Its feathers were thin lamine of wood, doubtless because birds, and hence true feathers, were unknown on Poros. Why on Earth, or rather on Poros, were the Ant-Men employing such crude weapons? Rifles they had aplenty, and powder was easy to manufacture. Besides, what did they know of bows and arrows, which had never been used by them even in the days before Kabat, the Menorian, introduced firearms upon the planet? Thus the arrows presented a perplexing problem. But a practical job remained to be performed before Miles was to have any time for abstract questions. The message to Cupia must be sent off. The Earthman returned to the radio set. The trophil engine and the generator were still running. The whole apparatus appeared to be functioning properly, and so Miles ticked off into space the following message. CQ, 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 DE, Kabat, Kabat, Kabat. I have returned to Poros Romanos. I am on the continent of Formians. I am in complete control there. That was a lie, but it would serve to hearten his supporters and throw fear of the Supreme Builder into the partisans of Yuri, whichever it reached. The message continued. Do not expect me soon, for I must consolidate what I have gained here. But when I do come, Yuri beware. My friends, hold out until then. I have spoken. D.E. Kabat. This message he sent again and again at every wavelength of which the installation was capable. He repeated and repeated it until he was tired. And then the first time he remembered his thirst and his hunger. Fortunately, there was both food and drink in the shack, so Kabat satisfied his wants and then went on at his message again. When at last he paused once more for a rest and shut off the trophil engine, his human ears caught a familiar rattling sound. Instantly he realized the situation. One or more of the Ant-Men were approaching. Sure enough, as he looked out the window in the direction of the sound, he saw two of the creatures trotting toward him across the plateau. Both carried rifles slung at their backs, so without waiting for their nearer approach, Miles opened fire. One of the Formians dropped, but the other turned and fled, and in spite of the hail of bullets which the Earthman sent after it, reached the crest in apparent safety and disappeared from view. Kabat knew what that meant to him. It portended the early return of the fugitive ant with scores of his fellows to lay siege to the radio station. Then a doubt occurred to him. What if these ants were members of Doggo's faction and he had killed a friend? And so, at the risk of his life, he unbarred the door and rushed out to inspect the dead body. But it was no ant whom he knew. Time would tell whether the surviving ant would return with friends or foes. Meanwhile, Kabat must get busy with his message. So, at it again he went. He rested and listened for approach of Formians. Occasionally he ate and drank. During his longer rests he carted the rifle, the ammunition, and some provisions into a point quite a distance down the mountainside and cached them there, for he had formulated a plan of escape. But mostly he stuck to his signaling. All Cupia, or such of it as might still possess long-distance radio sets in spite of the renowned domination of Yuri, must be made to know of the return of Miles Kabat from Earth. Night fell, and with it came a respite from the danger of Formian attack, for these creatures would never venture forth in darkness without lights, and lights would betray them. Miles spent part of the night in sending the message, part in watching for approaching lights, and part in dozing. Finally, along toward morning, he set about wrecking the set, for he did not wish the Formians to get into communication with Cupia and undo the effect of his own message by pointing out its falsity. Accordingly, he smashed the tubes, unwound the inductances and transformers, cut all the wiring into little bits, bent the plates on the condensers, chiseled through the coils of the generator, pounded through the trophil engine it into pieces, and drained the trophil tank. It would be many sinks before a new radio would be able to be built, if indeed these Formians knew enough of the art to ever build another. His work of destruction completed, he sat down to wait, but the inaction palled on him, and before he knew it he had fallen soundly asleep. He awakened with a start. It was broad daylight, and he listened. There was much rattling outside, so he walked to the door, unbarred it, and stepped out. He was not afraid, for on the evening before he had nailed above the door 2 cross sticks, and it was the Provian equivalent of a flag of truce. At a short distance stood a band of 30 or 40 ant-men, their leader holding a pair of cross sticks. Accordingly, the ragged Earthman advanced. Not one of them did he recognize, but this was no indication of their identity. Were they members of Yuri's faction, he wondered, or the faction recently captioned by the now deceased Doggo? If the former, they were conquerors intent on adding him to the list of conquests, but if the latter, they might be fugitives like himself. It behooved him to find out. So he proceeded to a slight depression in the mountain top, very near the group of Formians. This depression contained soil, and in it he scratched in Peruvian shorthand in the words, Yuri or Doggo, then pointed to his message and withdrew for a slight distance. One of the ant-men advanced alone to the depression, stared at the words, rubbed one part of them, and returned to his comrades, at which Kabat in turn advanced. The one word remaining written in the dirt was Yuri. So these were victorious enemies rather than fugitive friends. Waving a signal that the interview was at an end, Miles Kabat returned with dignity to the shack and pulled down his crossed sticks. But then, instead of entering, he suddenly dashed around the house and slid down the mountainside amid a shower of pebbles. Instantly the Formian pack rushed after him, but they were too late, for by the time they had gained the crest, he was safely under cover of bushes, making his way down the slope with his rifle, ammunition, and provision. The ant-men evidently feared an ambush, for they did not follow. This side of the mountain, the eastern, was wooded instead of the almost impassable boulders over which he had climbed up the other side 2 days ago. Accordingly, the descent was easy, almost pleasant. Soon he struck a path beside a little brook and followed it until it led into a fertile eastern plain which he had observed when he first topped this range of hills. Beneath a large tree beside the brook at the edge of the plain, Miles Cabot stopped and sat down for lunch, and it was while seated thus, with his back against the tree trunk, that an arrow suddenly whistled through the woods and embedded itself in the bark just above his head. Startled, he sprang to his feet, seized his rifle, and looked around. A second arrow sped through the air, and this one did not miss him. In due course of time, Miles regained consciousness. He was lying on the ground beneath the same tree, and there was an ugly gash in his head. His rifle, ammunition, and food were gone. His face and body were covered with clotted blood, and he felt very faint. With difficulty he dragged himself to the stream, tore off a piece of his ragged toga, and washed away some of the gore, but it required an almost superhuman effort. He lay on the bank and panted. His head swam, his surroundings began to blur and dance about, and then he swooned again. After what seemed an interminable amount of time, he became dimly conscious that he was lying on something less hard than ground. Soft arms were around him. Someone was crooning him into sweet words. Was this a dream, or was he back once more in Cupia with loved ones?